Good morning. My name is Raymond Whitfield. I am the son of Mrs. Ruth E. Whitfield, the eldest victim in the Buffalo, New York grocery store massacre. I am honored with this opportunity to make a few opening remarks for this crucially important subject of innovations in state prevention. As a survivor who has searched from that horrific day to this for solutions to curtail the barbarous acts of hate and unconscionable loss of life that we as a nation have become far too accustomed to, I need you to know that we as a family have sat in and sat out for media literacy, mental health to mitigation. We've marched for our lives in DC and scoured the halls of the Senate and the Congress, searching for common sense gun laws for someone, anyone with a constitution, if necessary, to help reshape a revered yet imperfect one. Driven by a survivor's sense of urgency, tempered by our backgrounds in response and communications, we understand the importance of careful planning, analytics, and measured steps. But irrespective of background or expertise, I think it fair to assume that we all know the same ubiquitous tools of social media to the dark web that are in use as I speak. For propaganda, recruitment can also be used for targeted countermeasure reforms. If we agree with this, would it not be prudent for us to follow the forward-leaning lead of New York State in identifying action-ready programs and initiatives like Moonshot with the proven ability to reach across states with best practices while reaching across the aisle, connecting with people where they are, from survivor to would-be perpetrators, to make a difference before it is too late? You see, what concerns me is that those nefarious forces are also planning, but unlike us, they are not burdened, but conjoined by the collateral damage of mass casualties and a traumatized community left reeling in their wake. So I appeal to you, as you continue to formulate your anti-hate strategies, ask yourself, how long can we afford to wait? From that damnable day at the grocery store to this, how many new and old towns have met my dear mother's fate? What I have come to learn in my pursuit of truth is that intervention is prevention, taking action. And act we must with all due haste. With that, ladies and gentlemen, innovations in state prevention.
Thank you, Raymond, for this powerful introduction and for your story. And again, welcome everyone for being here this morning on this incredibly important topic on intervention. Raymond said it best, it's about collaboration and best practices. And with that, I'd like to have our co-panelists introduce themselves before we have our discussion.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Raymond, for those powerful words. My name is Vidhya Ramalingam. I'm founder and CEO of Moonshot. We work on online prevention and intervention.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin Voce-Gardner. I'm the director of the Office of Counterterrorism for the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. I'm excited to talk to you today about an initiative that we developed following the racist domestic terrorist attack that occurred in Buffalo in May of 2022.
So Ben, I'd like to start with you, and the message we want to impart on everyone today, that it is possible to intervene with a person before they engage in violence. Please talk about what you're doing in New York.
Sure. So I want to start talking about this in the context of before Buffalo. I think we knew, seeing what had been occurring in America, that it was time to start to pivot from a 9/11 mentality. And I don't want to minimize the risks that foreign terrorist organizations or homegrown violent extremists pose. But the threat of domestic violent extremists and targeted violence is apparent every day. Buffalo, however, demonstrated the urgency that we need to make this pivot and the cost of the failure to do so. You're going to see a video after this panel that's going to talk about a really constructive partnership that we've had with the federal government in developing our strategy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the point I want to emphasize before we get to that video and before I start talking about our strategy is we've adopted a public health approach to addressing the challenges of domestic violent extremism. I've struggled personally, I think we've struggled as an agency with the equities involved in suddenly recognizing terrorism as a public health issue as opposed to an issue that we address exclusively through violence. And I think that's a really important conversation for us to have, and I think it's a really important conversation for everybody here to have. Are we making this pivot now because it's not Muslim men abroad, but rather it's white kids from the suburbs at home? And that's something that I've really struggled with. And the more we explore this and the more we see the benefits of taking a public health approach to addressing these risks of mass violence, the more I believe that it is absolutely the right solution, or at least it's a very important part of the overall solution. So with that, I'd like to talk about what we've been doing in New York. Following the mass shooting, Governor Kathy Hochul issued an executive order directing us to do a number of things. But for my agency in particular, we were directed to develop a domestic terrorism prevention unit that would focus on helping counties develop behavioral threat assessment management teams. And I'll talk about what that is in a minute. And then also identifying a way to intervene online. I mean, when you look at the Buffalo terrorist, was a young man who effectively radicalized online during COVID. Clearly an individual with deep-seated issues that went down a rabbit hole of hateful content online and began to believe the great replacement theory lie that has been put out there by the white supremacist community. And I'll turn it over to Ramya in a few minutes to talk in more depth about how we've approached addressing this issue online. But what we really wanted to focus on with grant funding and with staff was helping counties develop behavioral threat assessment and management teams. In other words, multi-disciplinary teams that are designed to intervene with people before they take that step towards violence. I mean, there is a fairly consistent pathway to violence that individuals get on before they commit acts of mass murder, mass violence. And the Buffalo shooter followed that path to a T. The goal for us, and I want to stress that my agency isn't a law enforcement agency. We work on policy, prevention, training, mitigation and response, but we're not a law enforcement agency. So in order to be effective in this space, we needed to find a non-law enforcement solution to address this problem. And that's not to say the law enforcement solution is not part of the overall solution, but our puzzle piece was, what do we do before a crime has been committed? So we've been working with counties to develop behavioral threat assessment management teams, and our direction to them was, you must involve law enforcement, education, and county mental health. But we recognize every county in New York is different. New York's a very geographically diverse, politically diverse, economically diverse, ethnically diverse state. And so a solution for one county was not going to look like a solution for another county. So we provided counties with the guidelines and the trainings on how to start to develop these TAM teams. And we've helped usher them into existence. When we started this initiative, there were 3 county-level TAM teams that had already existed in New York. We'd used federal grant funding to help sponsor them as sort of a pilot. The demonstrated success of those teams are what convinced us that this was the right path forward. And then it became a matter of convincing others that this could work for them too. We have already started to see success. We've had county representatives come to us and say, you know, a school raised an individual with us. Once we started to look into it, we realized that they needed assistance, but they were also clearly on that pathway to violence. These issues don't necessarily need to end in an arrest. In fact, I would say that an arrest is not where you take your victory lap. Rather, getting somebody into a therapeutic option, some sort of case management system is where you start to take your victory lap. But ultimately, we wanted to create an option that allowed personal stakeholders to come forward, right? We recognize that very few mothers are going to turn their son in, right? Very few children are going to turn their father in. And so we needed to create a system that created the space for the people who are most likely to be aware that somebody's on that pathway to violence to come forward and seek help for that individual, but ultimately to help protect our community and our society. The other component of what we've done, and I'll turn it over to Rami in a sec to discuss, has been working with Moonshot to develop that provider network in New York. Not surprisingly, there is not an enormous swath of people out there who are trained to address people who are radicalizing towards extremist ideologies. So that's something that we've had to build. And then finding a way to use online tools to direct people to get help themselves if they have the wherewithal to do it. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Raymond.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I want to go back to your opening comment about 9/11 and having taught at the graduate level for 18 years a course in Homeland Security, trying to make people understand what the real threat was in this country has been like turning an aircraft carrier around. And we had a conversation yesterday about us being ideologically agnostic, and we have to move that way. And I've always told my students, you know, as W. Edwards Demings used to say, he's a famous data scientist, without data, you're just somebody with an opinion. So with that, I'll pivot to you, Vidhya. We're making that change with regards to what that threat really is. We've always understood we've had an adaptive adversary, and they've gone from platforms we saw 20 years ago to now really leveraging and metastasizing online capabilities. Let's talk about Moonshot and what you're doing.
Thanks, Erroll. We all know, and you know, Raymond mentioned this, Ben mentioned this, it is so critical for us to intervene early, right? We want to get there early on in that process when someone is going down this rabbit hole. It's too late at the point of arrest. So to reach people early, it's critical that we meet them where they are, and that is typically online. I mean, we are all online. Everyone, many of you might be on your phones during this panel. We're all living our lives both online and offline. So it's no different for individuals that are at risk of violence. The online space is also, of course, where radicalization occurs. We know it's where grievances are validated and exploited. It's where arguments justifying violence are made, and it's where tips and plans are made for how to actually carry out that violence. But I believe that the online space also creates an opportunity for us to intervene. And Ben had already mentioned that the most effective opportunity for us to intervene with individuals is going to come from a public health approach, getting individuals into ideally a one-to-one with a trained clinician who can work with them over the course of months, sometimes years, to address the underlying risks. So as we are delivering prevention work online, our approach is to take what we know works offline, which is getting someone into that clinical one-to-one relationship, and we want to begin applying that online. So in New York, as we started working with New York State to build up an online prevention system for the state, we knew that in order to build that online infrastructure, we're only going to be as successful as the offline infrastructure that exists. So are there actually those service providers, those counselors, social workers, trained clinicians who are capable of having a conversation with someone who's presenting that risk online? So our starting point is to build a network of service providers. And these service providers are not just organizations who have been set up to work on terrorism prevention. We were really looking across the wider spectrum. We looked across the state of New York and looked at how many organizations are there who were set up to deal with gang violence, set up to deal with domestic violence, suicide prevention, all of these fields which involve a trained clinical provider dealing with someone who may be at risk of violence against others or against themselves, and who can work with that individual to immediately de-escalate them from violence and also in the long run change their paths. We identified 150 organizations across the state of New York that we believed may have the skills or the qualifications to intervene with someone who is going down a white supremacy path or an incel path or any one of these ideologies. We're now at the point where we've started with those 150 organizations. We're starting right now with 4 organizations who are currently undergoing vetting, due diligence, training, and preparing for the possibility to actually receive referrals of individuals who might be at risk of targeted violence or terrorism. And once we found that cohort of organizations, we recognized that they may need an additional layer of training, right? If they're organizations who were not dedicated to dealing with these kinds of ideologies, they might need that additional layer of training to get them comfortable with dealing with someone who presents with a white supremacy ideology, for example. And I should say here, organizations that were set up to do other forms of violence prevention have almost all of the building blocks they need to intervene with this particular audience we're talking about. It might just be that added layer of understanding the ideology. And as we're thinking about applying these sorts of services online, there might be an element about understanding the online environment, digital safety and security. So we're ensuring that they have all of those skills and the training that they need. The next step from there is, okay, great, you've got this offline infrastructure. Well, we need to actually be able to offer their services online. So we work with them to digitize their services. In the aftermath of the pandemic, actually, it's a lot easier because telehealth has become so much more common and digital service provision has become more common. And then once their services are made available online, the next question for us is how can we actually ensure that we are offering those services across the state of New York to anyone online across platforms who is consuming hate content, inciting violence online, doing all of these horrific things online which may not actually be illegal and may not warrant law enforcement going in, but which clearly tell us this person might be at risk, this person might need help. So the way that we reach them, the predominant way that we reach them is actually through advertising. It's pretty simple. It's the same way that you get sold shoes online when you search for a pair of shoes and then that exact shoe you were interested in follows you around the internet. We're using some of those same openly available tools. And the aim here is to ensure if you are anywhere in the state of New York, and let's say you either turn to a search engine to seek information about how to join a white supremacy group, or let's say you're on Quora and you're asking questions about how potentially to harm communities, which people do. Let's say you're on Reddit and you're seeking information about the incel community because you want to be a part of it. Those are the sorts of actions that if you take them in the state of New York, we will be there with an advertisement offering you a safer alternative. The chance to speak to a counselor, the chance to speak to someone who might be able to, on the one hand, de-escalate you from violence if you're at risk, but also work with you in the long run and work on some of those underlying drivers which might have led you there. One other point is we're not just seeking to reach people at risk of violence online, we're also seeking to reach concerned loved ones. Ben mentioned just how hard it might be for someone who's concerned about a daughter or a son or a brother to pick up a phone and call law enforcement, risk sending your loved one away forever. What we're hoping to do in this model is ensure that anyone online in the state of New York who is searching for how to cope with a loved one who might be going down this path, or who's, again, on Quora or Reddit seeking information about how to have a tough conversation with their son, that they are offered the opportunity to speak with a counselor, and that's a different offer, right? The offer here is, what can we do to help you because you are clearly dealing with a crisis at home, and we're not going to judge, we're not going to assume that your kid might be a terrorist, but you clearly need some support, and let's make sure we can get you that support from someone who's trained and specially trained to be able to support you. We've only just begun, and our service provider network is only in its initial stages in New York, but just to give you a sense of some of the initial figures and the initial impact, in the last 6 months, we've been running trial campaigns to reach out to these audiences of online people who might be at risk of violence, and we have made over 600,000 offers of support within a 6-month period. 600,000 times that someone in 600,000 times that someone in the state of New York was actively engaging with hate content, inciting violence, and they were offered a safer alternative. 10,000 of those times, that individual chose to click on an offer of assistance and to seek support, and over 20 people have actually reached out to speak to a counselor or a trained social worker, and these are individuals, once again, who are engaging with deeply violent content online. We are only just beginning, we're at the starting point, but if there's one point I can just make before going back to Erroll, is just the possibility that someone who is considering violence might actually be willing to seek help and might actually be willing to change their paths. You all have heard so many stories over the last several days from individuals who turn their lives around. There is a possibility for us to reach those people. We have to get creative in reaching those people, and we have to make sure when they're having those moments of doubt that we are there offering them an olive branch.
Well, Vidhya, first of all, thank you for the work you're doing. The data certainly emphasizes the success of your outreach. And it's really important that you both have emphasized the fact that we need to have a public health approach to this. We can't arrest our way out of it. I've seen in other countries, particularly in France and Germany, where again, they understand the importance of almost a soft power approach to this. But the one thing I do want to ask you, Ben, Raymond and I had a conversation yesterday that quite often the community stakeholders that we, the collective we, meaning the government, reach out to when these kinds of opportunities for resources are made available, the people at the table who we think are the community stakeholders are the people that we know. They may not be everybody. They may not be the right people in that community. So tell us how you're socializing your program to make sure that it really is a statewide prevention network that you're offering to people.
Sure, thank you for the question. So I'm going to answer that in 2 parts. First is one of the reasons we wanted to develop our behavioral threat assessment and management team initiative at a county level was to ensure that there were local stakeholders, right? Local colleges and universities, local employers, local religious institutions, school districts, government facilities, local community activists, right? This ensures that you've got sort of a baseline familiarity with the community that you're operating in, and I think that's critical for this to be successful. With regards to how do you do the outreach, candidly, that's something that we're still figuring out, and you know, we've been working with the counties to help them identify how they want to put that messaging out, and we've done a lot of that through grant funding. And they're exploring different options. Some of them are using online advertising, some of them are posting billboards, some of them are doing other messaging, right? And one of the things that we've been really focused on is making sure that we have a direct line of communication with all these counties, so as they come up with good ideas and best practices, we can share it throughout the entire state. And again, a solution that works in one county might not work in another, but we want to make sure that they're aware of what's going on and that these ideas are being shared communally.
Okay, excellent. Well, again, I just want to talk with you, Vidhya. You mentioned theory of change, which I think is just an incredible slogan for what you're doing. But again, we've got to, as we talk about this online platform and moving people to something offline and talking to them, what's been your biggest obstacle in making that happen as you rolled out this program, which has been quite successful to this point?
It's a great question. In some respects, reaching people online is the easiest part of the process. I already mentioned advertising. I don't want to downplay just how much expertise it requires to get those ads up and running, but you all experience ads on a daily basis, right? This is something that is relatively common. That part is simple. The hard part is ensuring that we have a safe place to send individuals to, and ensuring that the place we can send them towards is a service that is local to them and rooted locally. And this is where, when we started looking across New York State, I mentioned 150 organizations that we mapped across the state. That covers all 62 New York State counties. Now, in an ideal world, you would have a model where if you're in Erie County, you're receiving an advertisement for a service that is based where you are, and across, again, times that by 62 counties. Now, to reach that point, that's going to take time. That's going to take time, investment, training, trust building with those organizations, getting them to a point where they feel confident, where they have the resources to actually support someone local to them. In the meantime, though, and I mentioned we're starting with 4 service providers, we can do a lot with that. But the main challenge that we face is actually the offline element, getting that full infrastructure there such that everyone can get that personalized long-term service that they deserve.
Thank you. So Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot here, if I may. Many years ago, I was heading up a gang prevention program in Long Beach, California, and I'm setting up an office in this neighborhood, and it's a challenging neighborhood, I'll put it that way. And this young man comes in, he's about 12, and he says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, we're going to set up a gang prevention program. It's going to be an after-school center, and you can come here for activities and games and sports." And he says, "Oh, okay, well, it'll be open to everybody?" "Yeah." And he said, "Well, that's great. Well, when does the grant run out?" 12 years old. So I'm going to ask you, is this sustainable?
So I believe that it is sustainable for a couple reasons. I mean, from a state level, we've committed reoccurring grant funding to make sure that these are supported going forward. So that money will be there in perpetuity. More importantly, though, the buy-off at the county level demonstrates to me that this is a solution that works and that people are committed to it. They're not necessarily resource-intensive endeavors, right? It's a meeting of stakeholders every 2 weeks or every month on the tempo that they need to identify concerns they have and then to work between themselves to identify solutions. Those solutions are already there. It's just about making sure that the person who has the concern about their student, about their coworker, has the opportunity to access those resources. So we're not creating a whole new layer of community resources that have to be funded in perpetuity. We're really just talking about a time commitment, and I think what we've seen is that the counties themselves have already recognized the value of making that time commitment.
So what I'm going to do, before we go to close and then tee up the video, Raymond, as someone in the community, someone who's been a survivor, what advice would you offer to people like Ben, like Vidhya, who are offering these programs to communities that are affected this way? If you had a piece of advice, what might that be?
The thing that stands out to me is that this is an opportunity for the states to intervene with compassion. We were backstage, and I was asked, what's my take on it? It's got to be difficult because I lost my mother. To start with compassion for would-be assailants. And I said, quite the contrary. That compassion would have me sitting at home with my mom right now instead of, not that I mind being here with you guys, but not under these circumstances. Leading with compassion. And oftentimes our municipalities are not seen that way to various communities. So I think that is crucial, that compassion element in selling this to the community, to the household. And let's face it, the killer of my mother and that killer here in Pittsburgh, Many of them come from broken homes, from broken households. You are actually offering a helping hand to those homes because they can't handle that son in most cases, and God forbid it starts becoming women too, joining this fight in that negative way. So again, that would be the thing that stands out in my mind is how you sell this has to be that layer that, that puts the teacher at rest, that says, I'm not sentencing this person to a death sentence, I'm sentencing them to a life sentence because the alternative is that you go away for life or you end up on the death row like the individual here in Pittsburgh, and we're waiting to find out in Buffalo. So that would be my thing, that it just seems to stand out, resonate with me, is that you lead with compassion. And also that you include survivor voices in that because they can help.
Thank you, Raymond. Vidhya, closing remarks?
The only thing I would say is, I met Raymond, I think it was early this year, and it has been an honor to work side by side to come up with creative ideas and ways that we might be able to reach across the divide and actually speak to people who are going down this path. So if there's one point I can just echo, it's survivors' voices are not just important for their own stories and their experiences, but they are part of the solution, even in ways that you may not think. I mean, we're going to end this meeting and go out and start doing some mapping around messaging to white supremacists. And so I encourage everyone to think creatively about how we work with communities that are targeted by this violence. They're part of the solution.
Thank you, Vidhya. And Ben, I'll leave it to you to introduce the video.
Thank you. So we're going to tee up a video. Before we start it, there are 2 points I want to make. We're very grateful for the support we've gotten from the federal government as we've stood this initiative up. They've been partners throughout, and I think this video does an excellent job of representing the fruits of that partnership. But I do want to emphasize again the importance of the struggle we should all go through when making the determination that the public health approach is the right approach, and ensuring that, one, we do challenge ourselves to ask whether or not we've turned this corner because of who our perpetrators look like now as opposed to who they used to look like in the past. I think it's the right approach, but I think it's important that everybody who explores this also wrestles with that question. The second point I want to make is, and I'm incredibly grateful for the comments that Raymond just made about compassion, and I agree with that wholeheartedly, but this solution goes only so far, right? I don't want to minimize the importance of recognizing the evil that occurred and that there have to be consequences once somebody pulls the trigger. We're only part of the solution here. And with that, I think we can tee up the video. Thank you.
On May 14th, 2022, an individual motivated by a hateful ideology perpetrated an act of targeted violence and terrorism in my hometown, Buffalo, New York.
What happened on Saturday was an act of domestic terrorism.
Seeing how one individual can really shatter a community. Yes, it's the loss of life, but it's also the trauma that is experienced by that community, and it goes far and wide. In my capacity as a regional prevention coordinator, I work directly with state and local, tribal and territorial authorities to help inform them and assist them with the development and implementation of targeted violence and terrorism prevention. It's important for every community to understand that it may not have happened in your community, but no community is immune from this.
It shook all of us to our core. It was an attack that killed 10 Black New Yorkers, injured 3 additional New Yorkers. And it is incumbent upon all of us to make it so clear that violence, targeted violence, political violence is not an acceptable answer to a grievance. Our governor lives 12 minutes from where that attack happened. That's her home. And after the attack, she came to me and my team and said, what are we going to do about it?
Tragically,
that catalyst for us was the May 14th attacks, where a white, racially motivated, violent extremist terrorist drove from his home a couple hundred miles away near Binghamton, New York, to a Tops-friendly market in Buffalo because he believed that he would be able to attack and murder the most African Americans in the shortest period of time. That was an incredibly tragic, eye-opening, and catalyzing moment for me and for our state.
We're trying to shift from a 9/11 mentality that focuses on foreign terrorist organizations to homegrown violent extremism and domestic violent extremism here in the States. Part of that shift is a recognition that we need to be able to identify threats in an earlier stage before it progresses on to an attack. And that is recognizing when an individual is exhibiting warning behaviors, having a multidisciplinary team look at those warning behaviors and determine how much of a threat is this, what do we need to do about it, and then create a plan together to help.
There are foundational tools in public health that at their base are about addressing human behavior. It is about giving people and communities the information, the resources, the connections they need to take care of themselves.
Law enforcement is a vital part, but they're usually not the solution to the problem. They might be a part of the intervention strategies, but other social service agencies, nonprofits in your community, the pastors in your community, they all have something to bring to the table.
Before the Buffalo attack occurred, New York State began working with the Federal Department of Homeland Security and the National Governors Association on developing a state strategy to address things like targeted violence and domestic terrorism. CP3 was there. They helped connect us to partners throughout the country who had developed their own threat assessment management programs.
I definitely hope we can have an opportunity to reconnect on what we're learning. The events that occurred in Buffalo, New York was a primary catalyst to move New York State very quickly into the implementation of a very comprehensive, multi-agency, multidisciplinary, and multi-layered strategy towards preventing targeted violence and terrorism in the future.
We are requiring all of our counties to have domestic terrorism prevention plans, and we are using state money to fund those plans. And at the heart of those plans are threat assessment and management teams.
I believe that by having that multidisciplinary approach and having a co-lead has been beneficial in many of the counties. One county in particular in Western New York is co-led by law enforcement and mental health, and that's been very successful.
The behavioral health team is the co-response team for the Western New York area. We have clinicians in 6 police departments in Western New York, and they are to respond to all mental health crises. So we're really bridging the gap between community and police, but also linking clients and people that we serve with services.
Our co-response team, we really focus on de-escalation and crisis intervention, and we are able to keep people in their home and in their community 76% of the time. What this means is people don't need to be hospitalized and people aren't being arrested.
When we talk about threat assessment management, you really have to have co-equal partners across the spectrum. And so far, what we've seen has been a lot of our partners stepping up and getting comfortable moving into these new roles and being co-equals.
The whole idea is really get people talking and sharing information, break down those silos, get people into a room, get them talking, get them trusting each other. It's incredible. Every time I leave one of these meetings, I go, what the hell did we do before we had this?
We need all of our partners at the table who can help us interrupt pathways to violence. And that means I need the sheriff at the table. It also means I need the school counselor at the table. It means that I need the mental health professional at the table, but I also need the director of HR from the major employers at the table. We see over and over again when it comes to targeted violence prevention, there are puzzle pieces not connected. And in order to connect those puzzle pieces, we have to have those relationships.
The evidence is there that this works. It also allows us to leverage the relationships that each of those stakeholders have built within their local communities. We can build on the trust they've already established.
For our community, communities in New York and communities all over the country, collaboration is worthwhile because when you put dollars here, what you're doing is you're prioritizing the overall health of the community.
We are changing, I hope, the way that many Homeland Security officials approach the strategies they have available to them. That's going to take years because that's not just a budget change. It's not just a policy change. It's a culture change.
Don't wait for your buffalo. This is not expensive. This is not an enormous political hurdle. It's something that you can start doing almost immediately, and the resources and the guidance are out there to help you do it.
There's going to be a lot of states that identify new approaches and figure out better ways to do prevention. And we want to learn from that, and we also want to leverage that to make everybody better in preventing targeted violence in the future.